Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of RowingChat. I'm Rebecca Caro, and RowingChat is the lead podcast in the RowingChat podcast network. It's a group of people who just love talking about rowing. There are lots of different contributors, and if you're interested in joining us, please feel free to get in touch. The best way to follow RowingChat is to join our email newsletter. You get once a week a short message that has links to all of the episodes that were published during the week. And you can get that at rowing.chat/subscribe. Or, of course, you can go into your favorite podcast app and just subscribe to us. We do like it if you can tell your friends. And if you feel motivated, we'd love a review. Now, RowingChat would not be possible without our loyal sponsors. Our first sponsor this month is the Faster Masters magazine. It's for masters rowers who are keen to learn. If you're just like a sponge sucking up more information and tips about rowing, you could become a really good student of the sport, and learning will give you the confidence in your own rowing practice. This monthly magazine is authored by Marlene Royal and myself, Rebecca Caro, and it gives you 4 separate articles every month. You get a technique, performance, rowing lifestyle, and a bonus interview. This month, the technique article is about creating rhythm and run. And of course, as everybody knows, it's very easy to kill these things and very hard to get them back. Our second sponsor is if you're ready to have a training camp in Spain. Let us introduce you to the travel agency who will smooth your path to a marvelous camp. Castelldefels Stage Esport is a specialist tour operator who books sports camps, particularly for rowers. They specialize in the Spanish region Catalunya, which is near Barcelona. All you have to do is tell them the dates you'd like to come, and they'll do the rest. Book the hotels, the transport, the boats, the training venue at the Canal Olímpico de Catalunya, the food, and the excursions. Castelldefels is 17 kilometers from the wonderful city of Barcelona, so you can do time out too. All you have to do is show up with your coach and a training program. The team is taking bookings now for dates up to Easter 2021. And please get in touch with me if you'd like to make a booking via rebecca@caro.com, and we'll pass you on. Our last sponsor are the wonderful guys from The Science of Rowing. Will Ruth, Blake Gourlay, and Joe DeLeo have been podcasting on the RowingChat network for a couple of years now. And they've started a new monthly publication called The Science of Rowing. Each month, members get 3 takeaway-focused research reviews on rowing training and performance, a bonus video, and graphic content to help move the knowledge into application. They also have a podcast episode of the 3 of them digging further into the practical takeaways. You can find out more at scienceofrowing.com/rowingchat. You'll get details, a free sample issue, and a special discount offer. Now, I'm delighted today to be joined by Marco Altini on RowingChat. Hey, Marco. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do for a job.
All right, so I have a background in computer science engineering, a PhD in machine learning, another degree in sports science, human movement sciences, and high-performance coaching. So I've been working for the past 10 years, I would say, at the intersection between technology, health, and performance, mainly developing tools to quantify physiological stress, and using signals collected from the body with wearable sensors or phones to interpret that data so that we can provide useful insights to users and athletes to better manage their health and training. Right now, I run a small company, which is called HRV for Training, and we make a mobile application which can be used to track heart rate variability data and physiological stress over time, again, so that you can keep track of how stress has an impact on your body, make small changes, and hopefully optimize health and performance over the long run.
So technology, health, and performance is a relatively new subject. How did you first become aware? You're a data scientist, but you're obviously an athlete as well.
Well, just a recreational runner. I wouldn't call myself an athlete, even though I enjoy my time outside. But yeah, the interest also sparked that way. I was working in, let's say, more biomedical engineering. So, a decade ago, we would start developing these early prototypes of sensors and that you would place on the body to measure cardiac activity and all sorts of things that would be relevant during exercise. And it was also the right time in which you had the first smartphones, for example, so you could actually try to do something different, not just work with the tools that the company can make, but you can start trying to make something yourself that anyone potentially can use. So it started a bit that way, and experimenting on myself, experimenting on a few other people, colleagues that would be kind enough to put up with me, and then slowly this is where it ended up with a tool that now everybody can use and is used also in research settings, and simply to for us to learn more about also many of these processes that we did not understand fully before, and we still not understand fully in certain areas, I would say. But yeah, thanks to how easy it is today to collect data and how cheap it is, and then we can certainly learn more about the effect of various stressors on the body and improve things.
So the key core of your insight is around physiological stress. So for those people who are not biologists and not scientists, can you explain to us what is physiological stress and how does it affect you?
Yeah, in my way, it's really simply the combination of everything that we normally call stress, from psychological stress to physical stress. Especially in the context of training, we spend a lot of time and effort quantifying physical stress, so the workout, the intensity of the session, the repetitions. I think everybody from recreational athletes to professional athletes understand very well that physical stress is what you do during training, but then there is this whole other aspect, which is psychological stress. Every sort of stressor which has an influence on yourself, which could be simply worrying about work concerns at home, financial concerns, health concerns, currently with the global pandemic, many reasons to be stressed, and all of that has an effect on your physiology. That's why we use the term physiological stress. Basically, it just puts together physical stress, psychological stress, anything that affects your body, and that's what we try to quantify with the instruments that we make.
Fantastic. So lead us gently on. What is heart rate variability, or HRV?
So heart rate variability comes exactly from what is just discussed, so physiological stress. And basically, as your body tries to maintain homeostasis, which is simply a state of balance, your body is regulating everything from respiration to the heart beating to blood pressure, and everything needs to stay in your normal range, so to speak, so that you can function properly. I think this is easy to understand for parameters we know well. For example, again, blood pressure. You don't want your blood pressure to be very high or very low. It continuously gets regulated to stay in that optimal zone that is good for you. And heart rate variability is a similar concept. As we get stressed, the body tries to maintain this state of balance by regulating also heart rhythm, and that's what we measure. So once we measure heart rate variability, we simply measure the state of your body in terms of physiological stress. And typically this, if we try to break it down in something simple, once we have a reduction of heart rate variability, so let's say your heart beating gets a bit more constant, then that means that there is reduced parasympathetic activity, which simply means, again, higher stress. So higher stress is reflected on the body with a lower heart rate variability. And that's what we measure with these instruments. And I think it's important to understand also that everybody is different. So once we measure it, it does not really make much sense to compare individuals and look at the data that way. But we really want to try to do it every day and try to understand what's normal for you, and then again see how things change over time. If the scores reduce, it means there is higher stress for you in a given period of time. and that's useful information for yourself.
When did they first discover this? Because this is micro, tiny, weeny variations in how your heart rate beats, isn't it?
Yeah, true. Well, there has been, I would say, research for a long time now, but I think what changed a lot is the way we acquire this data. So while before, like decades ago, still we knew about heart rate variability, but it was difficult to measure, and then it was difficult to derive any conclusions. Then, once you have to get people in the lab and then have them, use an ECG or any even earlier device, and then look at these parameters after, a stabilization period of half an hour and situations like that, the only thing you would do at that point would be actually to compare people. What I just said, that it's not really meaningful, because you would just look at, broad changes across the population. And of course, you will see some differences. Like, that's why HRV is thought to be an overall marker of health since quite some time, more than of stress, because, when you look at people across a very broad spectrum, you have maybe older, unhealthy individuals with lower values, and then you have, younger athletes with higher values. But you would see that those differences probably also in other markers, right? It's simply, the population spreads across a broad range of health, and once you look at the more homogeneous sample, then it doesn't tell you that much. A better athlete does not necessarily have a higher score. So it's just, again, a marker of stress, which is very individual. So I think what we've been learning in the past maybe decade or even 5 years is that, we can finally measure daily. Athletes can measure at home. So, you don't need to get them to the lab. And because, the beauty, so to speak, of this metric is that it really captures anything related to stress. But then if you have people, for example, having coffee and then doing exercise and then getting to the lab where they measure, then you will be acutely affected by that stressor. And then your HRV will be impacted. So it doesn't make much sense either. Well, now, you can measure at home every day, and then you can really capture meaningful data points. And that's when we start, I think, to learn better individual responses to various stresses from, again, training or health-related aspects, illness, and all that follows.
So you've alluded to some of the different things that impact stress, from coffee to overtraining, under recovery, illness, injury. The measurements that you're describing happen on your smartphone. So your app uses a fingertip over the camera to record. Did you develop that software?
Yes, I did. So a few years back, we had the first, I think, apps that could measure heart rate. So just resting average heart rate. And that was a bit of the inspiration for me. And then, since I was working with these other wearable sensors that were able to do much more, for example, beat-to-beat heart rate variability, I started thinking, maybe we can do this also on the phone and make it much easier for people to measure, increase compliance, reduce costs, because still, even cheap sensors will still cost maybe $40, $50. And if we look at sensors that are not just straps, which are typically a bit more comfortable to use in the morning, they can be, $200, $300. So that's it gets quite expensive to start getting these measurements. So if you can just do it with your phone, well, you have that always with you, and it's much simpler and easier. So I developed that technology about 7-8 years ago. Then we also validated it, which of course is very important. So we need to show that what you measure with the phone is exactly the same that you would measure with an ECG or with a chest strap. And that's what we've shown in our published papers. So, it's a valid method, and it's much easier to do it. So that's the way we normally recommend using the system. But any other Bluetooth sensor that is, again, accurate and validated can also be paired with the app for people that prefer to use those. And those will also work.
Do you find any variation in the quality of data from, a Bluetooth ant, chest strap versus a fingertip?
Yeah, I would say that it is easier to measure, but also easier to mess it up. Because if you move, for example, if you move your finger when you have it on the phone, then this will create an artifact which will be problematic. That's why, for example, many smartwatches that we have these days, they will measure okay at rest, but then maybe you go running or do intervals, and then you will see that the heart rate doesn't really follow the effort because motion artifacts create issues in these technologies. So for the morning measurement, this is fine because we are not supposed to move. We are just lying down and taking your measurements, and it takes a minute. So what we say normally is that maybe people take 1 or 2 days to get used and familiar with the technology, and then they have no problem collecting high quality data. But yeah, I would say that's really the main thing, because otherwise, the technologies using optical measurements tend to be accurate mostly when there is no movement. That's why also you have these days some of the sensors that measure during the night, like the Oura Ring or some other devices, which they are accurate because you are sleeping and not moving. But if you were using them during exercise, it will be more problematic.
Yeah, understood. Now, you've implied that it's important to understand your personal HRV, but what can you do to control it if it's demonstrating stress?
Yeah, good question. We need to do something, because otherwise, we collect this data and what are we doing with it? So I think two things first. One, that is very important, the way we collect the data. I think, making sure that we are not affected by other confounding factors, so that, the data points really reflect our baseline chronic stress. And that means something very simple. So you just have to have your morning routine every day the same. You wake up, lying down, you take your measurement. And if that's not possible, which could be the case in certain situations, maybe, I don't know, people have small kids and they just make it impossible to take their measurement while resting in bed first thing in the morning. Another routine is totally fine. Going to another room, going to the bathroom, sitting, and then measuring. That's also totally fine, but it has to be consistent. So every day you need to do it in the same way. And that way you make sure that you are collecting reliable data points before you are affected by any other stress. Once you've done that, you collect your data, and then systems like ours will start to learn what is your normal physiology. And then after a couple of days, they will be able to identify, as you mentioned, periods in which your stress is significantly higher than normal for you. And then this will be highlighted in a way that you can do something about it. Because again, you do it first thing in the morning, so that's a good thing. It's quite actionable. Then you can make adjustments. And something that happens typically also in what we call HRV-guided training. So, research in which they try to implement these changes based on HRV, is simply to scale down often the intensity of the session. So if you had a high intensity session, for example, planned, you could try something, moderate or easy for that day, so that you don't load the body excessively in terms of stress, because, that would hinder recovery and you would take more time than in the longer term to get back where you were or to improve performance. So these kind of changes can be helpful. And again, as we said, stress comes from many sources. So it could be that you had poor values because maybe you slept very poorly for a couple of days, or you traveled, something happened. So I think it's very important to look at the situation that is specific to the individual. You are the best person typically to know, because you have all the context around what you were doing.
And you're also asked, in addition to the 1 minute heart rate measure, to give some markers. Can you explain what those are?
Yeah, so after the measurement, we have a short questionnaire. And I think that's very useful. Look at physiology. Then it's difficult. Maybe we had an issue with the connection. Everything is back, it seems. Okay. Can you hear me well? Okay. So I was just saying, we have this questionnaire where, you can enter data about subjective metrics, how you felt, how you slept, how you perceived your performance during training, all these sort of things, muscle soreness, all aspects that will help you contextualize the data and analyze the data later on, because without context, it's difficult to understand what is driving the changes in physiology. So that will allow you also to analyze different relationships, or simply to look at the data and, pinpoint different aspects that, where different situations that were going on at a given point in time, and that will help you again interpret the data. Plus, there are things that are not necessarily related to HRV. For example, muscle soreness, which is very important for athletes that train high intensity repeatedly. So it's good to have the full picture and putting together training load, subjective metrics, and objective metrics of stress like HRV.
So for yourself, can you give us an example of, say, for example, what does alcohol do to you?
Yeah, alcohol is always a very strong stressor. I think many people that start using these devices or apps or systems always are very surprised by the extreme change in resting physiology that you have in response to alcohol intake, which is typically much stronger than any session, any training. So that's typically good for awareness. I hear a lot of people that cut back a bit with the alcohol intake because of what they see. I mean, resting heart rate can spike 10, 15 beats in the morning, which is something normally associated only to things like illness. Training hardly changes your resting heart rate. 1 or 2 beats would be already a lot. So I think these are always useful insights for, again, awareness and dealing with stress and lifestyle choices a bit better.
Very, very good to learn. Now, let's move on to talking about elite sport, because I first heard about HRV in the context of rowing and particularly good performances. So how do high performance organizations take HRV? You've mentioned that they might just adjust a training session, but I'm guessing there's a little bit more to it than that.
Yeah, I would say I've seen different approaches. Well, of course, in elite sports, you try to optimize every single bit. So this is a useful parameter that, again, can help you quantify stress, and especially in a context in which, training is typically very well quantified and well planned, and there is a lot of thought in that. It can be useful to track these parameters as they reflect also other stressors that you might not be aware of as a coach, or even as an athlete. Something happens. Again, the pandemic is always a good example. People don't expect something like this to happen, and then it changes entirely their plans, the way things work at home, the way their racing season. So all sorts of stressors come up, and this can be quantified objectively. From elite coaches, I've seen people that simply use the device and the tool as something that just brings, again, awareness about certain aspects, or as a tool to start a conversation. For example, you see changes in resting physiology, HRV is reduced, there is higher stress in a certain period, nothing particular has changed in training. So it could be just an excuse to start a conversation with your athlete on other aspects that might be bothering the athlete, and understand what is happening, and then possibly make some adjustments there. Others rely more on the data in a way that, for example, they would use the approach that I mentioned earlier, which we see is effective in research, where you would scale down the intensity of the sessions, and you would do that again to avoid excessive stress when the body is already significantly stressed. And I think here there might be also a bit of a misconception sometimes. The fact that you increase stress and stress is reflected in HRV does not mean that if you have a high intensity training block or a high volume block, or you're acutely increasing your training load for some days or even weeks, it does not mean that you expect your HRV to go down. That happens only if you have a poor response. So if you're responding well to that training, you expect your HRV to stay where it was within your normal values, or even to increase, because that's a positive response to the stress. So I think this is very important to understand, that what we measure with HRV is how you respond to the stressors that are going on. And, this can be, again, a positive response, even if you have increased the load. And that's very important, because if you always had a reduction in HRV with increased load, then there would be no point measuring it, because you would have that information already because you measure load. But it's really about how you respond to that load. And that's why it's effective.
So that's really interesting, because it's probably the only independent validator of how the training program is being taken up by the athlete, because in many sports, until you actually do a race, you don't know how you have been going. And there are so many variables that go into a training program that optimizes the athlete's ability to get the most out of the program. But it also, presumably, if you're very, it allows the coach to increase intensity and see how the athlete responds and whether or not they can sustain it.
Exactly. And, if there are other planned stressors, like going, to training in the heat or training at altitude, then again, you can see how each individual responds to that.
I definitely think it'd be really interesting to see some of the altitude training results. Have you ever done that?
Yeah, actually, I just did that this year with the Dutch Triathlon Federation here, so the elite athletes in the Netherlands. As part of a project I was doing at university, we looked at the data as they went to the altitude camp. And we had really interesting data there, because we had some expected responses. For example, you go to altitude and the first few days you have increased resting heart rate, reduced HRV, increased heart rate as they train as well, because, you have to adapt to the hypoxic environment. But then what was really interesting was that the athletes that adapted better to the altitude stimulus had, let's say, a change in resting physiology the first week of the camp that was less dramatic than the athletes that then struggled more to adapt to the stimulus. So basically, the first few days, you could already capture, who's going to adapt more or less to the altitude camp based on how their physiology responded. So I think those also can be useful indicators in that context.
Very interesting. Lucky you. So you mentioned elite triathletes from the Netherlands. Who else trains using HRV?
I think at this point, a very broad range of athletes as our customers. We go the whole way from amateur clubs to, the NBA and Olympic athletes, because, what we see, it's not really about the level of the athlete, because everybody experiences stress, right? So if you are a recreational athlete, you have most likely a lot of stress from other sources. If you have a professional athlete, training might be your main stressor, but then, the way you deal with it also mentally is very different. It has a much larger role in your life. So we see that to be employed in a certain setting at this point, in which it's still, I would say, quite niche, it really depends a lot on the persons that are involved, like the coach, the sports scientist. If they have a curiosity and an experience with these platforms or with these tools, they will bring it, anywhere at every level, because they see the value. Otherwise, if this is not something they know or are familiar with or are still a bit skeptical about, then, it doesn't matter, again, the level they train, it's just not going to get there. So it depends a lot on who's involved. We worked a lot in the past with Daniel Plews, who was also coaching some of the best rowers in New Zealand. And, he's an advocate of the technology also, because most of his PhD was on the topic, and, he used it a lot with elite athletes, and he's an Ironman himself. He's coaching now, I think, mostly triathletes. So all of these people, use from, I think Jan van Berkel probably is his best athlete right now. So, these are some of the best athletes on the planet and rely on the technology in various ways. I would say, again, awareness, understand how you're responding, gaining confidence, because, you're doing a high intensity block, your physiology is where it should be. So again, nothing to change. It's not necessarily that you want to change something unless you see that, maybe the response is not what you were expecting, and then you can play with that.
I'm going to hazard a guess that Emma Twigg was one of Dan Plews' athletes, because she had a perfect year. She didn't lose a single race.
Good to hear. Now,
there's a couple of websites here. So talk us through, Marco, what's on the HRV.tools website?
Yeah, here we provide a bit of an overview of the tools we make from the main app, which is HRV for training, which is, I would say, our consumer tools, which anyone can use to, measure their resting physiology using the phone. And, the app will provide a lot of insights and interpret the data for you, translate it in words, and make it easier to understand everything that is happening at the physiological level. That's normally what we recommend using for people getting started with the technology. We have some other solutions also for researchers and scientists. This third app called Camera Heart Rate Variability is mainly used for research studies. It basically does not provide any interpretation, and it allows simply you to measure these parameters using the phone. So, many studies now are using it because it's just simpler and cheaper, and then they design their own study and collect the data and analyze it. And then we have the middle one, which is an app for biofeedback. So that's a bit of a different use of the same technology. Instead of assessing stress, which is what we do with HRV for training first thing in the morning, with biofeedback, you try basically to perform breathing exercises that should have an effect on your physiology. So it's more of an intervention. So you try to strengthen your parasympathetic nervous system by doing deep breathing exercises similar to what you might do, for example, if you meditate or do yoga. And that's a bit, I would say, the solution that we have right now.
That's fantastic. So you can actually, you're telling us you can train your body to be better at managing physiological stress.
Yes. I think this is more experimental, but it's really fascinating, so that you can yourself proactively try to self-regulate, emotionally and eventually physiologically, so that you can deal with stress better.
And then, of course, the second website is your own personal one, Marco.
Yeah, exactly. There is where I have, I would say, also most of our research and, any news related to the work we do. So, and also contact information. So if anyone, has additional questions or would like to use the tools, we always try to help.
Fantastic. Now, the popular apps are already available in the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store. So you can just go and search for HRV and then the number 4 training. And
Correct.
that is that the one that you'd recommend for rowers?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's the most complete tool and easier to use, and that's the one I would recommend.
And the price is $9.99 in British pounds, probably a little bit more in American dollars. I don't know.
Yeah, it should be similar, around $10. Yeah, the Apple Store changes this sometimes, but it's pretty similar.
And that's a one-off fee.
Yeah, exactly. No subscriptions. So once you spend the $10, then you can use it forever.
Fantastic. Marco, is there anything I haven't asked you that you think you'd like to tell people about HRV?
Yeah, I think this was a good summary. So yeah, it was definitely good conversation points. Nothing to add.
Fantastic. Marco, thank you for giving us your time, for generously sharing your amazing insight. You must be one of the leading people in the world doing this. And for all the rowers listening, I do hope that you get a chance to investigate HRV and see whether or not it's something that you'd like to try in your own training and recovery management. I'm Caro, and this has been Rowing Chat with Marco Altini. Till next time, bye-bye.